Lukas.
I don't know what this is.
Yeah, Facebook.
Yeah, right. She mentioned that you studied at the time. So she was my PhD supervisor. Okay. At Imperial College?
Yeah, it's a short program.
Yeah, exactly. When did you finish?
不知道是不是现在太累。
So yeah, so 20 years ago. Well, thank you so much for organizing. Thank you. I'm very grateful to you.
So whether it's going to eat chair.
Yeah. Okay. Rieppel? Yeah.
Okay. And after he's also very good at so he will bring us to
okay. Great. I don't need some like organ meat.
Okay.
But anyway, it's not.
I
like spicy food.
Okay.
Sichuan food is my favorite.
Yeah,
okay.
It's just my favorite taste. But it's a nice place. So Natalie is going to take care of this.
Well, it's very good public relations.
Yeah.
Made you the most well-known historian of science.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. I think there might be thousands of followers.
Yeah.
I'm not his follower, but somehow that his Facebook page got it reversed.
So you're kind of the central node on Taiwanese history. Oh,
Yeah. So I have to.
Oh no.
可以调。
Yeah, it's great.
So when I organize a talk, there might be 5 or 6 visitors. And you see how many times.
Yeah. So it's all for computer.
Exactly.
觉得
You should make it for them.
Yeah. We can share the unheard.
是不是？不是这个。不知道。要往前移一点。
从。 题吗？
没有办法对焦，我感觉。
好像紧张。
Okay, yes.
Dear colleagues and friends, on behalf of the Institute of History and Technology, I would like to welcome you to attend this lecture by Professor Lukas Rieppel. Professor Lukas Rieppel is currently teaching at Brown University, the History Department at Brown University, and he did his PhD at the History of Science Department at Harvard. And I'm particularly delighted to learn that his PhD thesis is supervised by Professor Janet Brown, who is also the supervisor, Professor Hong Guangqi from National Taiwan University, who helped arrange this lecture. And also, Janet Brown is also my tutor when I was doing my postgraduate study before she left for the States. And so we are sort of connected by the same teacher. And today he's going to talk about a topic that I think is of great interest for people at this institute and a lot of people in Taiwan. Because he's going to talk about the famous Northwest Natural History Expedition in the Northwest China, and it's an expedition that try to identify the origin of human species, but it ended up this famous discovery of dinosaur eggs. And this is the talk will be, it's part of his book project. The book I think is near completion, and so a book on the history of American paleontology and especially the study of dinosaur. And so without further ado, please welcome Professor Rieppel.
Thank you. So I especially want to thank my friend Kwang Chi and also Professor Lee for this opportunity, to thank all of you for coming to my lecture. So I'm very grateful to be able to present some of this research in this institute at the Academia Sinica. So as Professor Lee mentioned, the lecture that I want to give is based on a chapter of a book that I'm writing about the history of dinosaur paleontology in the 19th and early 20th century. And the vast majority of the book is about in the United States and also in Europe. So I know very little about Chinese history, but there's this very important expedition that took place in the 1920s that was sponsored by the Natural History Museum in New York into the Gobi Desert. So it's an expedition from the United States to the Gobi Desert that was headquartered in Beijing. To write a book about the history of paleontology during this period and not say anything at all about this expedition because it was so enormously famous. As Professor Lee mentioned, it was led to the first discovery ever of dinosaur eggs. Not mention this expedition, but I also knew that in order to write about this expedition, it forced me to learn some Chinese history, which is an area that I know very little about. And so I couldn't imagine a better place to present this work than the Academia Sinica, given its close historical relationship, as you will see, with some of the controversies that were elicited by this expedition to the Gobi Desert. And so I wanted to say I'm especially looking forward to not just being here, but also especially looking forward to hearing all of your comments and your criticisms and your suggestions after my lecture, because I'm planning on revising. The book is sort of near finished, but I'm planning on revising some parts of it. And this chapter in particular, I'm planning to revise quite substantially. So if you have any suggestions or thoughts or comments or ideas about what you disagree with or what you think could be different or anything at all, I'm very interested and curious, and I would be very grateful to hear what those are. So as I mentioned, so this is the main photograph that was taken in the 1920s of the American explorers who went to the Gobi Desert. And the main character is this fellow here, very strange looking in this picture, but his name was Roy Chapman Andrews, and you'll hear a lot more about him soon. So this is a map that was produced by the expedition. It was published in a book that was published kind of to communicate the results of the expedition. And you can see that it took place in fact, it lasted slightly longer than 1930. It lasted until about 1932. But it took place during the course of the 1920s, so from roughly 1922 to 1932. And so it was very long and drawn out scientific exploration. In Beijing, the scientists spent most of their time in Beijing, but during the summertime they would go to from Kaogan into the Gobi Desert, and each year they took a slightly different route, and spent about 10 years exploring this region. This is a book that was published halfway through the expedition, about 1926, by the leader of the expedition, Roy Chapman Andrews, who was a kind of explorer in the United States, wrote many popular books about his explorations, the most famous of which was the exploration of the Gobi Desert. In this book, he explained, this is a book that he wrote about the first half of the expedition, and he explained he mentioned the purpose of the expedition was primarily of human beings. So early on, this is that was very popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, that human beings had evolved in Asia. There was a controversy about whether human beings had evolved in Africa or in Asia, and many scientists, including Charles Darwin, believed that human beings must have evolved in Africa, mostly because many close relatives of humans, chimpanzees and gorillas and things like that, live in Africa. But many other scientists believed, for various reasons, that the origins of humanity, of human beings, could not be in Africa, it must be in Asia instead. One of them was Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was a famous paleontologist in the United States. And during the 1920s, he was the director, so the head of the New York Natural History Museum. And as such, he was Henry Fairfield Osborn was Roy Chapman Andrews' boss. So Andrews was working for Henry Fairfield Osborn, and Andrews wanted to go on an expedition. He wanted to have a kind of grand exploration. Earlier in his life, Andrews had spent a lot of time working with whales in the Pacific, especially in Japan. And so he knew Asia fairly well. And so Andrews had this idea to take Osborn, this theory that Osborn was very fond of, which is that not just human beings, but many, many different animals, especially different mammals, including human beings, had evolved in Central Asia. And to test this theory by sending an expedition that he would be the leader of into the Gobi Desert. This is a map that he reproduced in this book that he wrote, and it shows, it kind of gives an illustration of what he called Osborn's prophetic theory. And you can see that, according to Osborn, what this map shows you is the place where different kinds of animals were thought to have evolved. So, for example, Archaeodactyla, our even-toed ungulates, were thought to have evolved in North America, Carnivora somewhere in North America. But most mammals he thought had evolved in Asia, including primates and, as such, human beings. And here you can see Anthropoida in sort of South Central Asia. I mentioned this is a theory that was popular among many scientists. So this is a famous early example. This is a map from a book by a German biologist named Ernst Haeckel, who was someone who was very influential in spreading Darwin's theory of evolution in continental Europe. It's a book called Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte, which means the natural history of creation. It was a very popular book published in 1868. Translated into many, many languages, including into English, and went through many, many different editions. And here you can see Haeckel, many different races of mankind, 12 races of mankind, but all of them, according to Haeckel, originated in Central Asia. So whereas Darwin had thought that human beings had originated in Africa, according to Haeckel, it was somewhere here in the kind of Great Plains, somewhere perhaps north of Pakistan, somewhere in Central Asia. So Andrew's idea was to go from Beijing into the Gobi Desert, so slightly further north had postulated the origins of human beings, and to look for fossil evidence of early hominids. Of course, this is also, this is 1868, but by the time Andrews went to Central Asia in the 1920s, this theory had acquired many proponents, including Andrews' boss, Henry Fairfield Osborn, in part because of the discovery of Peking man. So there were some important hominid discoveries in China prior to Andrews' expedition that gave some evidence to support this idea that perhaps human beings had evolved in Asia. It turns out that Andrews was unsuccessful. He did not discover any fossil evidence of early hominids. And so in that respect, the expedition, which lasted for 10 years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, which in the 1920s was a huge amount of money, the expedition was not very successful. There were, however, some other discoveries. So there weren't any discoveries of early hominid fossils, but there were some other discoveries. Two that I'll mention quickly. One was a mammal that was named the Baluchitherium, because it was discovered north of Baluchistan, somewhat near sort of Afghanistan or Pakistan. But most famously was the eggs of dinosaurs. 1922, an assistant named George Olson discovered these interesting looking round, sort of oval-shaped fossils that initially there was some controversy about what they perhaps could have been, but quite quickly paleontologists agreed that they must be fossil dinosaur eggs. And this was the first time that anyone had ever found dinosaur eggs. And so therefore it was a very, considered to be a very important discovery. They discovered these eggs alongside of a dinosaur that's pictured here. The fossil of that dinosaur is pictured here, called Protoceratops. So Protoceratops is a small and early relative of the more famous cousin Triceratops. So this dinosaur that's famous for having these kind of three horns sticking out of the crest behind its neck. Protoceratops was a smaller and slightly older precursor of Triceratops, and so that's why it was called Protoceratops. Anyway, the eggs were thought to be Protoceratops. It's interesting that subsequent paleontological expeditions in the late 20th century, in the 1990s, again led by the American Museum of Natural History, the New York Natural History Museum, found evidence that in fact these eggs were not the eggs of Protoceratops, but rather another dinosaur, a meat-eating dinosaur called Oviraptor, which had also been found by Andrews' team. But Andrews and his paleontologists believe that Oviraptor, which is a meat-eating dinosaur, must have been robbing the egg. They could not imagine a carnivorous dinosaur as having laid these eggs and kind of patiently brooding its young. And so they assumed that it must have been robbing the egg, which is why they named the dinosaur Oviraptor. So it was more recently that that interpretation has shifted, and Protoceratops is no longer considered to have been the animal that created these eggs. In any case, it was a very important discovery nonetheless, and it created a lot of press, including a kind of publicity stunt that Roy Chapman Andrews orchestrated. So the eggs were discovered in 1923, and in 1924, the following winter, Andrews, as you can see from this article, so this is the New York Times, January, Andrews decided as a kind of publicity stunt to hold an auction, so you can sell that he, to hold an auction to sell one of these dinosaur eggs. It's a very controversial thing to do. For many reasons, it was controversial in the United States, as well as it would turn out to be very, very controversial in China as well as in Mongolia. For various reasons, in America it was controversial. There was an idea that science was supposed to be very distinct, very separate from business, from commerce, and to sell a scientific specimen was therefore an unethical thing to do. As well as some other reasons, in fact, Andrews, who thought that this auction for these eggs would produce a lot of but also publicity for him and his team, in fact failed to have its desired results. They were only able to find a single person who was willing to bid on the eggs, and he was only willing to bid $5,000, which was the minimum price, which is not a small amount of money, but it's not such a large amount of money as you might expect. So it was a very controversial thing to do. It was also controversial in China because many Chinese scientists and Chinese intellectuals thought and argued that selling these that had been discovered in Mongolia amounted to looting Chinese antiquities, looting Chinese national treasures for commercial purposes, for selling them in the United States. So it created a large amount of controversy in China. Initially, Andrews was not too worried about this because, as I mentioned, so I can go back to this map here, the expedition was based in Beijing, so spend the winters in Beijing, and then they would go from Khalgan into the Gobi Desert. And as everyone in this room knows much better than I do, during the 1920s, different regions in China were controlled by different sort of local local armies. But that changed at the very end of the 1920s when Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Kuomintang, which had set up a kind of government in Nanjing, were able to consolidate their control over China during a military expedition that is often described as the Great Northern Expedition, during which Chiang Kai-shek was able to capture Beijing. And in fact, Chiang Kai-shek's ability to capture Beijing and his team were the expedition had become very controversial. It had created a lot of controversy, not only in the United States, but especially even more controversy in China. And as a result, when the nationalist government seized control of Beijing and the expedition returned from the Gobi Desert back to Beijing, all of the fossils that they had collected that summer by a group of Chinese officials who initially the Association of Chinese Learned Societies, but soon thereafter changed their name to the Commission for the Preservation of Chinese Antiquities, which had a kind of genealogical connection to the creation of Academia Sinica. And they seized the collection and prevented Andrews from accessing the Mongolian, accessing the Gobi Desert in the future. So there was a diplomatic incident that ensued as a result of this. Andrews himself described the conflict with the Chinese Antiquities Commission as a anti-foreign sentiment among Chinese nationalists. Established after the expedition had come to an end, which he called the New Conquest of Central Asia, a sort of unfortunate title. I think it's kind of, in some ways, exactly making the argument for that the Antiquities Committee was accusing the expedition of being a kind of imperial enterprise. Andrews, I think, unwittingly sort of gave them evidence that, in fact, that's the case, just through the title of his own book. Nonetheless, Andrews, in this book, he kind of uncharitably characterized the opposition to the Central Asiatic Expedition as having been based on misconceptions among the Antiquities Commission of what the expedition was up to. So he said that the Chinese nationalist government, through the Antiquities Commission, accused the American explorers of having, quote, trespassed upon China's sovereign rights, that we had stolen China's priceless treasures, that we were spies against the government, that we had been searching for oil and minerals and smuggling opium. So what Andrews was claiming is that the Antiquities Committee, the Committee for the Preservation of Chinese Antiquities, had misunderstood a scientific enterprise, mischaracterized the scientific enterprise as an invasion of Chinese sovereignty, as a kind of imperial exercise aimed at plundering China's national treasures, bringing them back to the United States, and in some cases, in the case of these dinosaur eggs, even selling them for a profit. So what I want to suggest in my talk today, in my lecture today, is that I want to give a kind of alternative account of what the expedition was. I want to locate the expedition within a larger context of the connection between the history of imperialism and the history of natural history, and suggests that, contrary to what Andrews and Osborne and other American scientists insisted, that that rather than thinking about science and imperialism as two separate things, that in fact the expedition could be both a scientific enterprise as well as an imperialist enterprise at the same time. So in making this claim, I'm drawing on a rich tradition of historical work in the history of science that suggests that the history of natural history has always been a kind of imperial enterprise, that that natural history would not exist as it does today, and certainly as it did in the 19th and early 20th century, had it not been for a long history of colonialism and imperialism. So science and imperialism have long reinforced one another. They need not be seen as being in opposition to one another. And that in Andrews' case, in the case of this Central Asiatic expedition, in fact, it's perhaps one of the, it's an especially clear case of this kind of mutual relationship between science and, in Andrews' case, American imperialism. And I think we can see that by taking this accusation that Andrews tried to reject in his own work, and sort of taking it at face value and asking what happens if we think of expeditions like the Central Asiatic Expedition as a kind of intelligence gathering expedition. So some of what I'm going to be trying to do in the next 30 or 40 minutes is to kind of, that we can understand what Andrews was doing as a complex form of intelligence gathering. But a kind of intelligence gathering that involved gathering all sorts of different kinds of intelligence. So not only strategic intelligence that was useful for military purposes, as we often think of espionage as being, but also commercial intelligence as well as scientific intelligence. So we can think of science as being on a kind of spectrum alongside of other sorts of useful knowledge, including strategic knowledge and commercial knowledge. However, the final point of the argument that I'd like to suggest, the Central Asiatic Expedition, although I think it continues a long history of the relationship between natural history and imperialism, it also represents or indexes an important and I think quite interesting shift in imperial history. That the kind of imperial exercise that the United States was engaged in and that the Central Asiatic Expedition was an expression of was quite different from the kind of imperialism that we often associate with European countries in the 18th and the 19th century. So that it's a new kind of imperialism that often is described as neo-colonialism, and I'm going to suggest that we can also understand it as part of the history of kind of global capitalism. Okay, so to just kind of step back a little bit and think about the broader context of the broader historical context into which the Central Asiatic Expedition, within which the Central Asiatic Expedition can be understood. As I mentioned, there's a lot of history by many historians, including Landa Schebinger, Fatih Fan, many others, documented in very rich and convincing ways the close relationship between the science of natural history and the empire. And some of the best examples, of course, are the East India companies, so the Dutch East India Company in Southeast Asia, and perhaps even more so the British East India Company in South Asia and India, and the kind of European imperial projects, in particular the British Empire. So the claim is that what much of European, in 18th and 19th century European colonialism consisted of was an attempt to control the access to global natural resources. And natural history can be understood as a kind of accounting activity. Exploration and documentation of the location and abundance of different kinds of valuable resources in different parts of the world. And if imperialism is, at least in part, an attempt to control the flow of goods and the extraction of natural resources, then the ability to identify, document, and map the location of different kinds of natural resources, of course, is a foundational element of the imperial enterprise. And a perfect example of this is the British East India Company, which, of course, began as an attempt to try to monopolize the South Asian spice trade, and very, very quickly develop into a kind of administrative state, literally administering territory in South Asia until the 19th century, mid-19th century, when the South Asian subcontinent was, the work of administrating the South Asian subcontinent was overtaken by the British states directly, which led, of course, to the creation of the British Empire. Right. So, this is a map from I believe it's 1886. It's hard to read on this projection. Yeah, 1886, and you can see, right. So Britain has this kind of global empire that extends to North America, South Africa, Australasia, but also South Asia, and that the creation of this kind of as well as other parts of the world, of course. The creation of this global imperial system, the claim is, would not have been possible and would not have happened, would not have been profitable without the science of natural history. In the case of the United States, there's a kind of similar story that we can tell. And what's interesting is that the story of America's 19th century empire is deeply connected to the history of American paleontology. So this is a story I'm only going to give you a very kind of brief synopsis of, but it's a story that I try to tell in more detail in the book that I'm working on. So as I'm sure you know, the United States was founded initially as a British colony on the eastern coast of the Atlantic coast of North America. And in the late 18th century, it gained independence from England. And subsequently, there was a push to kind of expand the United States westward into the interior of the North American continent, eventually as far as California. Initially, for example, with the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson from France, but subsequently the westward expansion all across the United States. An expansion that happened, of course, at the expense of large groups of indigenous peoples, Native Americans, who lived all across the North American continent, including along the Atlantic seaboard when the United States was first created. But an expansion that in the 19th century was often described by Americans as a kind of manifest destiny, so a kind of God-given right to expand westwards into the North American western part of the country. This is just a very famous painting that was produced in the 19th century. This is a kind of allegorical figure representing the future, representing progress, and the claim is that, on the leading edge of westward expansion are farmers and kind of pioneers and homesteaders, followed by technology, civilization, the railroad, and then finally cities. This is, of course, southern Manhattan. And the claim that I try to make in my book is that it's this process of westward expansion that leads to the discovery of dinosaurs in the American West, in places like Wyoming and Colorado and Utah, which creates the conditions for the United States in the second half of the 19th century to become the world's most important, at that time, the world's most important center for dinosaur paleontology, because it was in the American West that one could find the most interesting and the most abundant dinosaur fossils. It's worth pointing out that today, in our current time, that distinction belongs to China. So especially northwestern China, Liaoning province, where some of the most interesting dinosaur discoveries are now being made. Anyway, westward expansion happened throughout the 19th century. An important moment in this was the creation of a building of a railroad, which was completed in 1868, that linked California to the middle part of the country and further east to New York. A big part of why the United States expanded into the American West had to do with an interest in exploiting the abundant natural resources, in particular the mineral resources that were available there. So there was a kind of mining economy that was created and fostered in the American interior. And it's the extraction of all of these valuable natural resources that produces an absolutely explosive economic growth in the second half of the 19th century. So you can see this is a measure of gross domestic product. It's not quite exponential, but it's nearly exponential growth. And it really takes off around the middle of the 19th century, after America had a civil war in the middle of the 19th century. So after the Civil War, there was this kind of boom economic boom created by the exploitation of different kinds of natural resources, including mineral resources in the American West. And so this, of course, brings us to natural history, because how did people know where to find these mineral resources and these valuable natural resources? Because natural history engaged in exploration of the American West. So among others, the United States government created a geological survey that was involved in mapping the American West and discovering the location of important resources and communicating those resources to interested commercial parties who would then exploit them in order to fuel the American industrial expansion. Interestingly, though, of course, the U.S. Geological Survey also was a scientific enterprise. It was not only a commercial enterprise, it was both a commercial and a scientific enterprise. And it was largely responsible for the growth of American paleontology. Just to give you two examples, this is a publication of the U.S. Geological Survey from 1870 on the mining industry. So it's part of a survey that was done of the 40th parallel by Clarence King. And this particular book was authored mostly by James D. Haig. But there were many, many other books that came out as part of this series of the exploration of the 40th parallel, including a very important book by a paleontologist named Othniel Charles Marsh on the Odontornithes, or extinct toothed birds in North America. This is one example of these. It's called Hesperornis. It's hard to see, but what's important about this bird is it's a Cretaceous bird, so it's from the Mesozoic period, the time of the dinosaurs. And what's important is that it had teeth in its beak. So there was a big debate at the time about the relationship between reptiles and birds, and whether dinosaurs might be a kind of missing link between reptiles and birds. And the discovery of birds with teeth furnished fossil evidence for the genealogical or taxonomic relationship between dinosaurs and birds. So Marsh also was very influential in dinosaur paleontology, and in 1896 he wrote this very important book, The Dinosaurs of North America, which also was one of the reports of the U.S. Geological Survey. So the claim is just that it's the exploitation of natural resources as part of this westward expansion that spurs a kind of interest in doing natural history of the American West, and it's that then, in turn, leads to the creation of a community of vertebrate paleontologists in the United States. But of course, this westward expansion involved the displacement, as I mentioned, of many native peoples, indigenous peoples who lived in these areas, who often contributed materially to the discovery of fossils. So this is just one famous example. This is Charles Marsh again, the same paleontologist who wrote those two books that I mentioned, the one on birds and the other on dinosaurs, who forged a kind of alliance with a Native American named Chief Red Cloud, who was a chief of the Lakota Sioux, so American Indian group from the kind of northern Great Plains region, the Rocky Mountain region. The reason they forged this alliance is complicated and very interesting, but it has to do in part with Marsh agreed to represent the concerns of Red Cloud to the U.S. federal government in exchange for Chief Red Cloud and provide support for Marsh's paleontological activities. That support included both protection from other Native American tribes, so kind of military support, you might say, but it also involved providing Marsh and his collectors with information about where to find dinosaurs. Here's just a quote. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can read it if you're interested, from another important paleontologist in the United States at this time, Edward Drinker Cope, who, this is a quote that I have from a letter that he wrote to his wife, in which he describes the way that he used from Native Americans to guide him in helping him find dinosaurs and other kinds of important fossils. So the claim is that this process of westward expansion is what mostly was driven by the desire to find valuable natural resources, but also was fueled by a desire to create knowledge about the American West, and as such led to the creation of vertebrate paleontology in the United States. But it also led to the displacement of local people. Native Americans were pushed onto small reservation lands. So people who had once occupied the entire region of the American interior were pushed onto very small reservation lands. people who had been materially important in contributing knowledge about where to find specimens to American paleontologists. So the claim is that this is a kind of example of traditional 19th century settler colonialism, right? An expansion of an imperial state, that initially was located in this part of North America, and subsequently throughout the 19th century, colonized the rest of the North American continent, and in so doing, pushed indigenous populations onto these small reservation lands, which you can see illustrated in red. So people that had once occupied this entire territory are pushed onto these smaller regions. This is a map of the U.S. reservation system from 1892, as the United States of America colonized the rest of the North American continent. A process that was fueled by and made possible by the exploration of the American naturalists, including naturalists working for the U.S. Geological Survey. So the question is, okay, so that's the kind of story for paleontology and imperialism in 19th century America. So the question is whether Andrews is right that what he was up to in a few decades later in the 1920s in Mongolia has any relationship whatsoever. Is it completely different to what was going on in the 19th century in places like British India or in the American West? Or is it completely different from that? Or is there some kind of connection that we can draw? Does it make sense to accuse the Central Asiatic Expedition of having had imperial goals, of having infringed on, trespassed upon China's territorial sovereignty and stolen China's priceless treasures and acted as kind of an intelligence gathering expedition, kind of espionage movement? Okay. What I want to do, I have about a little bit less than 30 minutes left. So what I want to do in the time that I have left is to just kind of go through and think about whether what it would mean to take seriously the accusation that the Central Asiatic Expedition represented a kind of imperial enterprise, insofar as we can understand it as having consisted of a kind of intelligence gathering expedition. And if so, if it does make sense to characterize it as kind of imperial enterprise, to then ask ourselves, well, what kind of imperial enterprise was it? What vision of empire did it represent? And the claim would be that it represents a different kind of vision of empire than the 19th century vision that I described in South Asia or in the American West. And, I wanted to just kind of quote from the manifesto of the Association of Learned Societies, which became the Commission for the Preservation of Chinese Antiquities, which I mentioned was kind of an important precursor to the creation of the Academia Sinica, who in a manifesto that the late 1920s argued that, so it's a bit hard to see, the text has been cut off, but that the new government, the new Kuomintang nationalist government, opposed foreign expeditions, not only the Central Asiatic Expedition, but many other foreign expeditions as well, insofar as they, quote, infringe our sovereignty, plunder our research materials, and cause great loss to the future of Chinese academic development. I should mention that this was, of course, a manifesto that was written in Chinese, not written in English, and so I'm very grateful to Zhao Peiyan, whose dissertation constructing the Chinese has been enormous for me in translating some bits of Chinese literature, including this manifesto into English, so that I can read it, since I can't read Chinese myself. Would be that the Andrews and other explorers at the time who mounted expeditions, such as the Central Asiatic Expedition, that they were accused of engaging in a kind of imperial enterprise, even though they were also engaged in a scientific enterprise. Right? So the claim is not that that imperialism and science were some of these disconnected things, but rather that by engaging in a natural history collecting, that in itself constituted a kind of imperialism, because it involved the extraction of not just natural resources, but cultural resources and scientific resources from China, transporting them back to the United States and putting them in American museums, such as the Natural History Museum in New York. As you can imagine, American paleontologists strongly objected to this kind of characterization. American paleontologists wanted to draw a sharp distinction between the kind of natural history, the kind of scientific enterprise they were involved in, and the kind of imperialist enterprise that they were accused of. This is an interesting letter that was written by Walter Granger, who was another member of the expedition, a paleontologist who accompanied Andrews to Central Asia, in which Walter Granger made an argument to Ma Hen, one of the senior members of the of Chinese antiquities, that there should be a sharp distinction between the collection and expropriation, export of archaeological artifacts and paleontological artifacts. So the argument was that because dinosaurs are older than humans themselves, dinosaur fossils cannot be considered cultural objects. They do not belong to any particular culture. They do not belong to any particular civilization. Rather, they belong to all mankind. And therefore, even though perhaps the Chinese Antiquities Commission had a right to prevent the export of Chinese archaeological artifacts, they should not prevent the export of paleontological artifacts, because paleontological artifacts are older than Chinese civilization itself, and therefore ought to be seen to belong to all of mankind, including naturalists in the United States. Henry Fairfield Osborn, the president of the the New York Natural History Museum, made a very similar kind of argument in many different places, including in an appeal to the Chinese ambassador in Washington, D.C., in which he stated this explicitly. So he said that the American Museum has taken the leading part in advising the protection and retention by the Chinese people of their archaeological and artistic collections. This principle, however, does not apply to natural history collections, which at the present time exploration is free throughout practically the entire world. Thus, in every country, the distinction is drawn between the archaeological and artistic works of man, which should rightly be retained within the country which created them, and the natural works of nature, which are freely interchanged. Of course, one thing that one might wonder is, well, where does that leave mineral resources like petroleum, which are even older than dinosaurs, and which many people, of course, might think ought to belong to the country in which they are discussing, an argument that Osborn did not engage in. Osborn made very similar claims in public as well, so not only in private correspondence, but also there was an attempt, somewhat successful, I should say, attempt to shame the Chinese Antiquities Commission by publishing these kinds of critiques and these kinds of arguments in international scientific journals, including in 1929 an article that Osborn wrote in Science magazine, in which he claimed that by preventing the collection and export paleontological specimens, the Chinese Antiquities Commission were violating the norms of international science, that they were turning what ought to be a kind of international cosmopolitan enterprise into a nationalist enterprise. And that this was, in fact, to the detriment of Chinese science itself, Chinese science, which Osborn described as excuse me, having been somewhat underdeveloped in the early 20th century. That there was a kind of debate about whether we ought to understand the activities that the expedition, Andrews and the expedition were engaged in as a kind of expropriation or appropriation of Chinese national treasures, or whether it ought to be seen as the furtherance of world science, right, as a kind of international endeavor. And what I want to do in the time that I have left is just kind of give some reasons for thinking that these two things need not be understood as being incompatible with one another. That in fact, science is often not just an imperial enterprise, but a nationalist enterprise, and deeply tied up with commercial extractive practices, including in this 1920s expedition was tied up with commercial extractive practices and other kinds of intelligence gathering sort of projects. So one claim I want to make is that we can understand this expedition as having been a kind of intelligence gathering expedition, and that we should think of science itself as a kind of intelligence gathering mission. And I'll have more to say about exactly why I think that's the case and what I mean by intelligence gathering. But again, I just want to kind of point out the title of this, unfortunate perhaps title of this book that Andrews published as the very first contribution to this series that came out of the Central Asiatic Expedition, The Natural History of Central Asia, in which he himself described the scientific enterprise that he was engaged in as the quote new conquest of Central Asia, right? So you might think is a kind of epistemic conquest of the Gobi Desert through the practice of science, through the practice of natural history, so that we can understand science itself, imperial enterprise, sort of taking knowledge from one place and bringing it to another place. But not only knowledge, also taking specimens. So paleontological specimens such as the Protoceratops and then the Oviraptor eggs, which at that time were thought to be Protoceratops eggs. Taking them from the Gobi, putting them in boxes, shipping those boxes to New York, preparing the specimens in New York and putting them on display in New York, and publishing scientific treatises to the benefit of New York scientists based on knowledge that had been in addition to extracting scientific intelligence from Central Asia, that I'd like to make the claim that Andrews and his expedition were also engaged in extracting military and commercial intelligence. So in terms of military intelligence, I have many examples, but I'm just going to show you a few here. This is a letter by Andrews to a colonel in the U.S. military, in which he thanks the U.S. military for having supplied the expedition with a topographer. So it turns out that, in fact, the expedition was sponsored, among others, by the Office of Naval Intelligence, as well as the U.S. Military Intelligence Division, and that many of the people who participated in the expedition, one of the mechanics, for example, as well as this cartographer, were engaged in doing espionage work. So making maps of Central Asia, locating strategic resources of various kinds, as well as valuable other kinds of resources, including natural resources, getting all of that intelligence back to the United States military. Indeed, as this document that I found in Washington, D.C. shows, Roy Chapman Andrews himself, so this is a kind of personnel file, Roy Chapman Andrews from the Military Intelligence Division of the U.S. Army. Roy Chapman Andrews himself was doing espionage work for the U.S. American Military Intelligence Division, claiming to have specialized knowledge on all sorts of things, including influential persons in China, the location of bridges, fords, and ferries, forests, the location of fuels, so petroleum reserves, mines, railways, roads and trails, telegraph and telephone systems, and so on and so forth, right? So that all information that may seem fairly pedestrian, satellites was extremely important for strategic purposes. And as you saw on the previous slide, the expedition was involved, among other things, in making maps of northern and northwestern China, and locating all of these strategically important kind of infrastructure onto those maps, communicating them back to the United States military. And finally, the expedition was also engaged in gathering and disseminating and communicating a large range of different kinds of commercial intelligence, some of which is very typical kinds of commercial intelligence. So this is just a letter from Andrews to someone at Standard Oil. So Andrews was very skilled at fundraising. The failed auction for dinosaur eggs notwithstanding, that was not a very a moment of high skill on Andrews' part, I would say, in part because it led to the expulsion of the expedition from China. But in other respects, he was very good at raising funds from American corporations to produce the kind of scientific and intelligence work that he was engaged in. So in this case, he's writing a letter to Standard Oil, offering to communicate information about the potential location or absence of petroleum deposits in the Gobi Desert in Central Asia, something that, of course, Standard Oil is very interested in knowing about, in exchange for funding, primarily through, he was asking the Standard Oil to donate petroleum to the expedition. I'll show you why in a minute. They had many motor cars. Much of the expedition was conducted using motorized transportation. So asking Standard Oil to provide petroleum free of charge, provide gasoline free of charge for the cars, in exchange for information about the potential location or absence of petroleum reserves, which Standard Oil might like to exploit. Another kind of commercial intelligence, so that's just one example, there's many others of that sort, but another kind of intelligence that Andrews, that I would like to suggest we can think of as a kind of commercial intelligence that Andrews gathered in Central Asia was basically publicity of various kinds. The early 20th century saw the proliferation of kind of popular culture in the United States, including cinema and popular magazines. And one such magazine, Asia Magazine, the American Magazine of the Orient, was one of the major sponsors of the Central Asiatic Expedition. And Andrews agreed in exchange for, he agreed to write popular articles that would be published in Asia Magazine, but he also agreed to give popular lectures. So he would often spend, he spent most of his time in Beijing, but usually once a year or once every 2 years, he would return from Beijing to New York in order to raise funds, in order to coordinate with the Natural History Museum. But when he returned to the US, he would often go on these lecture tours and give popular lectures in which he made quite a lot of money. So not only publishing popular articles and popular books, lectures in which he made quite a lot of money, which again, I would suggest can be thought of as kind of a sort of extraction of commercial knowledge, right? Commercially valuable knowledge that can be sold through magazines, through lectures, and as I'll show you in a minute, through motion picture films by American companies. So as I mentioned, if I can get it to work. No. Here we go. So the expedition also included filmmakers. So if you look in the, if you go to the archives of the New York Natural History Museum, there's a large amount of motion picture film, and I'm just showing you some of this. So this is film footage of the discovery of the dinosaur eggs. And this was footage that was taken for many reasons. One reason was that Andrews used this film footage to illustrate his public lectures. But there was also, Asia Magazine distributed this film footage through newsreels. So at the beginning of a feature film in the early 20th century, there were often kind of short newsreel films that were shown to audiences, and these were sold to cinemas as a kind of drawing customers into the movie theater. And so the motion picture film that was produced in Central Asia was also shipped back to the United States, again to make money for commercial purveyors of popular amusement. To look at this film footage, a great deal of the film footage so as I mentioned earlier, much of the expedition was conducted using motor cars, and especially motor cars built by Dodge Motor Companies, which is an American auto manufacturer, and what were called Fulton trucks, so a different auto manufacturer, and a huge amount, just large amounts of the film footage is film footage of this kind, sort of showing the expedition making its way through the Gobi Desert, traversing difficult terrain, as you can see here, right? Kind of going over rocks, going through difficult desert landscapes, using these American-made motor cars. I was kind of curious why that might be the case, and it turns out, looking through the archive, that this was another one of these commercial agreements that Andrews had. So you see a kind of theme emerging here that Andrews had managed to engage in. So this is a letter from Andrews to the advertising department of Dodge Motor Cars, and the deal that was struck was that, again, the auto manufacturer financially support the expedition in exchange for free advertising. So it's a kind of product placement in a scientific expedition. Right? So this is something that often happens still now in the cinema. That, for example, Pepsi Cola will sponsor the creation of a film in exchange for the film showing people drinking lots of Pepsi Cola, right? In this case, it's a scientific expedition where this auto manufacturer helped to sponsor the scientific expedition in exchange for Andrews explicitly promising during his public lectures to mention by name, I think at least twice he said he would do it. Every time he gave a lecture, at least twice he would mention Dodge motor cars. And as you could see, he used this motion picture film that I showed you earlier to illustrate his lectures. And that's why so much of the film shows these automobiles, because the lectures, which were illustrated by the films, were in fact, among other things, a way to make money for himself and for Asia Magazine, but also a way to advertise these American automobiles. The claim being that if it's possible to traverse the harsh landscape of the Gobi Desert in a Dodge motor car, just imagine what it can do on an American road. Anyway, there's also lantern slides that were produced. So these are kind of transparent photographs that were later colored by hand. And again, I just show you this one, again, to illustrate these lectures. I show you this one again, just to show the prominence that was given to the automobiles, right? So this is a photograph that was taken precisely to commemorate the discovery of the dinosaur eggs. So this is Andrews, very much like an explorer. This is one of his assistants. Presumably it's George Olson, the guy who actually discovered the dinosaur eggs. And then very prominently displayed, you have the Fulton motor truck and the Dodge motor car. So again, a kind of product placement in natural history. This is the popular natural history journal, the popular journal of the American Museum of Natural History, the New York Museum. And again, Andrews wrote an entire article. So the kind of commercial ambitions of the expedition couldn't be any more clear. So just as a kind of conclusion, the kind of big claim that I tried to make in this lecture is that we can think of the Central Asiatic Expedition in very broad strokes as a kind of intelligence gathering mission. And to the extent that we can think of it as engaged in gathering intelligence of various different kinds, so both military intelligence, the strategic nature, commercial intelligence about the location of commercially valuable natural resources, for example, but also information that could be used to sell cars, information that could be used to sell magazines, information that could be used to draw in crowds to see a film or to see a lecture, as well as scientific intelligence, right? Knowledge about the history of life on Earth, perhaps about the history of dinosaurs. Hopefully there was initially supposed to be the generation of knowledge about human prehistory, which turned out not to be successful. But all of these you can think of as different kinds of intelligence. Question I'd like to make. And if you think of all of these different kinds of knowledge that's being produced, strategic knowledge, military knowledge, commercial knowledge, as well as scientific knowledge, as a kind of intelligence, then I think it's not so, the kind of claim that the Central Asiatic Expedition was a kind of imperial enterprise becomes much more persuasive, I think. And so why do I want to say that these different things that the museum is engaged in doing constitutes a kind of intelligence gathering, rather than just saying the usual thing that we say when we talk about the history of science, which is that it's a knowledge-generating enterprise. The claim I want to make is that the reason I think it makes sense to describe all of these things, strategic, commercial, and scientific knowledge, as a kind of intelligence gathering is because what Andrews was engaged in doing and what the other people in his expedition were engaged in doing was not just in producing information and circulating that information, making sure that information reaches as many people as possible. I think rather the right way to think about what they were engaged in doing was trying to control or manage the flow of information, to try and take control over not just the production of knowledge, but also who would have access to that knowledge. This is probably most clear in the case of strategic intelligence, right? Andrews was not willing to admit to anyone, certainly not the Chinese Antiquities Committee, but also not to the kind of American public, that he was engaged in espionage work, right? So this was information that was not widely disseminated. It was disseminated only among a small group of people. But you can also see it in terms of the commercial knowledge that was created. He did not, for example, share any of the information that he sent to Standard Oil, the location of petroleum reserves, with the wider public, right? It's not about disseminating that knowledge as widely and circulating as far as possible. Rather, it's about controlling precisely who has access to this kind of information. In the case of the motion picture films and so on and so forth, of course, there the idea was to try and expose as many people to that knowledge as possible. But again, only certain aspects of that knowledge, right? the product placement of the motor cars would not have been successful had all of the audiences to the lectures and the motion picture films been informed that Andrews was paid to put these automobiles into the motion picture films. And finally, the kind of scientific intelligence, of course, the publications that came out of the Central Asiatic Expedition, the books and the articles that were published, as wide an audience as possible. But when it came to the specimen objects, again, there was a very kind of asymmetric attempt to very tightly and carefully control who would have access to these objects and who would not have access to these objects. Much of the debate, much of the controversy between Andrews and the American Museum of Natural History in New York versus the Chinese Antiquities Committee was precisely over the specimens, right? Whether the specimens ought to remain in China, whether they ought to remain in the committee, or whether they ought to be exported to New York. The claim is that
any kind of local Chinese institution or government, because there were kind of information asymmetry in that time, in the 1920s. The Chinese people wouldn't understand science and archaeology or kind of this kind of knowledge. So they wouldn't understand what Andrew's team were doing in China. And they said that they were based in Beijing and went to the so and the rest of the time of the year and when they were in Beijing, what kind of activities were involved, and if there was any connection with local Chinese institutions and any.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I suspect my answer will be somewhat unsatisfying, but I'll do my best to try to answer your question. So my understanding is there was remarkably little interaction between Andrews and his expedition and local Chinese intellectuals of various kinds. Perhaps for the kind of reason that you suggest, that there was a kind of incommensurability perhaps, of these different groups that what local Chinese intellectuals were engaged in doing would not have been recognizable to the American explorers, and vice versa, perhaps, that what Andrews and his expedition were interested in doing was not easily translatable, recognizable to Chinese intellectuals, which is perhaps part of the reason why it was interpreted in cynical ways, right, as a kind of an attempt to steal treasure, to steal natural resources from China. And part of what my talk has tried to do is to sort of think about the expedition through the kind of critique that was made of the expedition among Chinese intellectuals. That said, as far as I can tell, there was very little kind of positive interaction. What did the members of the expedition do when they were in Beijing? And there's not as much information about that in the archives that I could. So part of the reason I said earlier my time is that I would love to know how Chinese intellectuals viewed the expedition in Beijing, let's say, for example. But I don't read Chinese, and so I don't have access to those archival materials. The archival materials that I do have are all from the American side of things. And as far as I can tell, at least my sense is that the American explorers did not have much respect for the Chinese intellectuals, and for that reason, they did not engage them in a kind of collaborative way. They didn't engage them in conversation. What they spent, it seems to me, what they spent most of their time in Beijing doing in the wintertime was kind of socializing, but socializing with other expatriates. So my sense is there was a kind of expatriate community in Beijing at the time, and there was a kind of thriving expatriate community, and there was a kind of rich social life that one could engage in there. The one thing I'll say is that after 1928, when the Antiquities Commission managed to gain a lot more leverage, there was one final time that Andrews entered the Gobi in 1930, and he was forced to bring some kind of Chinese delegates from the Antiquities Commission with him into the Gobi, including a Jesuit priest and 2 Chinese intellectuals. And again, I don't have much access to that information, but what I know about it comes mostly from Cheyenne Penn's dissertation, and the way she describes it is that these 2 groups went to the desert together, but didn't really talk to each other very much. So they were there together, but they didn't. There wasn't much actual exchange happening between them. So that seems to be kind of indicative of the larger attitude, certainly among the American explorers towards the Chinese.
Thank you for a talk of global reach. So this is a Central Asian expedition into China wasn't the first. So in the late 19th century, it was Sven Hedin, who was led by Russia, and then we have Orlstein, who again went to Central Asia and to Xinjiang, and that was backed by Britain. And then came Pompeo, who discovered, slightly after Stein discovered Dunhuang, this national mood for preservation of national treasures of antiquities that lasted into the response in the 1920s. But those are two expeditions at the same scale. Right? So this was backed by a wealthy and resourceful museum, and Stein and Hedin pretty much went on their own. And so they are kind of precursors to this. But they are also expeditions at a much bigger scale, and also on a global platform, which took place in the late 19th century. And this is a parallel to this. You know, in the second half of the 19th century, in the Ottoman Empire or in the Persian Empire, the Germans were seen sort of like a benevolent third party, because Britain and France was looked at worse invaders, and then Germans came along to Empire and to Persia, and then helped excavate archaeological right? And here in this picture in China, again, Americans were the most benevolent foreigners than Britain and France. So Britain and France created the most trouble and forced China to open the country in the second half of the 19th century, and Japan was becoming aggressive in the beginning of the 20th century. But America, who joined the Boxer Rebellion forces, but then they donated all they got into a scholarship that funded Chinese students to go to China. So Americans, in comparison, was the benevolent foreigners. The Germans were in the Near East in the second half of the 19th century. So you compare this expedition to the explorations of the 19th century of the settler colonial empires, but there were a different mode of precursor, which was the Germans.
Yeah, thank you. Hello? Okay, yeah, thank you. So I think I think that's a great, I think that's a very strong point that you make. So I have to think more about that. So one thing I'll say for sure, though, is that want to say that what the American expedition was doing is the same as this kind of 19th century settler colonialism. But I want to kind of provide a contrast between the American colonization of the American West and the British colonization, let's say, of South Asia, and the kind of imperialism I do want to suggest the Central Asiatic Expedition was engaged in. So the claim would be that it's a more, what you're describing it as a more kind of benevolent,
to some extent,
activity, and I guess I'm a bit skeptical. So I would describe it as a more subtle and perhaps more sophisticated, but nonetheless imperialism, a kind of neo-imperial, kind of free market imperialism, right? A kind of capitalist imperialism. But nonetheless, the primary purpose of which was to benefit the United States. It was not to benefit. You're right that there's some overtures at collaboration made between the Americans in other respects and China in this period. For example, Andrews did involve the State Department, his negotiations. Hello? Excuse me. Andrews did involve the U.S. Department of State in his negotiations with the Chinese Antiquities Committee. And there was, to some extent, the State Department was willing to get involved. But for the most part, they were not. For the most part, they said, look, you have your dispute. We don't want to kind of intervene on your behalf in the dispute. We don't want to intervene in the dispute on your behalf because the U.S. Department of State had all sorts of other diplomatic activities that I think you're right were more collaborative with the Chinese that they didn't want to jeopardize at this moment. At the same time, so the claim is that yes, there is a kind of maybe a kind of that is that the United States wants to project, and certainly Andrews included in that, right? You claimed that, oh, you know, I won't put it back on the slide, but there's that quote by Henry Fairfield Osborne where he says, well, you know, we're doing a service to the Chinese because we're discovering all of these fossils that that Osborne claimed the Chinese did not have the knowledge to be able to preserve for themselves, and so that the American Museum was creating knowledge about Chinese prehistory that could be useful to the Chinese, but that the Chinese, according to Osborne, weren't equipped to produce for themselves, and so on and so forth. But the claim would be that that is a kind of argument whose ultimate purpose is to benefit the American Natural History Museum. Its ultimate purpose is not, they were not willing to leave any specimens in China. The sticking point came over whether, you know, half of the specimens or all of the duplicate specimens or what exactly ought to stay in China, and basically the position of the American Natural History Museum was none of the specimens can stay in China. So I think you're right that there is a strong difference between the kind of overt settler colonialism British practiced in South Asia and the Americans practiced in the American West, and what early 20th century Americans are doing. But I think it's nonetheless, in some ways, a kind of imperialist enterprise. So another example that I would give from the history of medicine would be the creation of the World Health Organization. I think that, in a sense, is a kind of benevolent organization, but in another sense, it can be seen as a kind of imperialist organization, or the kind of the United States Peace Corps, right? Sending American kind of like cultural diplomats all over the world in order to kind of help local populations, but ultimately, the United States. So a kind of a more subtle, perhaps a more benevolent, but not therefore an unimperialist kind of enterprise.
I'm not saying that the Germans or Americans went out disinterested. Of course, Germany has its own imperial interest when, with what they did in Russia or in today's Turkey. But I'm saying that they, in comparison, they were the most welcome.
Yeah.
Because of this image that they, or this image advantage they enjoy, especially in comparison with Britain and France. And in the Chinese case, Americans had that image. And in Turkey or in Persia, Germany had that image. And they both took advantage of that.
Yeah, so I mean, I would love to speak more with you about it, because as I said, the main reason I'm here is to ask for advice and suggestions. So if you're willing to talk to me more about kind of the Chinese perception of the United States in the early 20th century and how it might help me to understand this expedition better, I would love to, if you have suggestions on things I can read, for example. But I would say, the one thing I would just say once again in response is that to the extent that this kind of seeming benevolence made the United States welcome in China, that's precisely what the purpose of this kind of imperialism was to open up Chinese markets, was to make Chinese natural resources accessible to American corporations, and so on and so forth. So being welcome was a kind of precondition, or a kind of the goal of this form of neo-colonial global capitalism. So anyway, the main thing I want to say is that I welcome the criticism, and I'm curious to hear more about it. Yeah.
Kevin is my colleague at this institute, and he works on early modern European science and medicine, but also history of philology in the 19th and 20th century. Well, may I interject a little bit? Well, maybe the American during the late 19th and early 20th century is often perceived as more benevolent because they have a kind of open door policy, don't want to play a balancing role. But on the other hand, in your case, I think you can also argue that the behavior of this team from a kind of nationalist resistance or backlash, at least among the Chinese intellectuals and elite, maybe not ordinary Chinese, but at least so there's kind of a strong sense of being plundered or being unfairly treated. And I think that's also I think that's in this case there was indeed a strong Chinese reaction. Any other question? Yes, please.
So one of the things you described was a symbiotic relationship between nation states. Is that what you're calling an imperialist, like a sort of imperialism, when it's a symbiotic relationship where both nations are like benefiting in a way?
I'm not sure. Maybe I'll ask you to clarify. So as I recall, I think I was trying. So maybe I misspoke, or maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. But what I was trying to say was that there's a symbiotic relationship between in this kind of neo-imperialist framework, kind of which the open door policy I think is exactly a great example of this. There was a kind of symbiotic relationship between the nation state and private enterprise. So the suggestion wasn't that there's a symbiotic relationship between different nation states, that the United States was primarily interested in the well-being of China. Rather, the claim would be that the United States was primarily interested in the well-being of American private enterprise, including private enterprises of a scientific nature, so non-profit corporations as well as for-profit corporations. So the Natural History Museum, as well as Standard Oil, as well as Dodge Motor Cars, and so on and so forth. And in order for those private enterprises to be successful, it was important to have an open door to all sorts of places, including China. And in order to ensure that open door, it was important to be received as not as an occupying power, but rather as more of a kind of partner in economic exchange or something like that. Economic and intellectual and other kinds of exchange.
Thank you for clarifying. I would suggest you put that at the beginning, like kind of like a definition definer, because to me, when I thought of imperialism, I was thinking more of classical imperialism, but that's obviously not what you were referring to. I didn't know you said neo-colonialism, but I didn't really know what that meant, so I was kind of like in the dark for the whole speech, or presentation rather. So yeah, I just think putting that at the beginning and kind of defining how you're using a word that's not in a classical sense would help the audience paint a picture in their mind of what you're really referring to. Thank you.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for that. So that's useful.
Good afternoon, Professor Rieppel. So I'm an assistant at this institute. I have a question for you that you have mentioned. So in your presentation, so Chief Red Cloud. So and she has served for the expedition. So for dinosaurs fossils in the West, in the United States. I'm curious whether Andrew also has some intimate relationship to the local peoples like the Mongols, Uyghurs, or Kazakhs, and what's the image? So, what's the image, and did they play the role so in Andrew's publications, and also Andrew just didn't need any help for the local people. He only relied on the advanced motor cars or that equipment. So okay, that's my little question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite similar to the first question in some ways. So the question is whether there was collaboration or exchange or dialogue between the members of the expedition and Chinese intellectuals in Beijing. And you could ask a similar question about local people like the Uyghur or the Mongolians in the Gobi Desert. Again, my sense is, if there was, it was not publicized as such. So certainly in the books and articles that Andrews wrote, local people show up, but they show up more as objects of curiosity or objects of anthropological knowledge than as sources of natural history knowledge. Which is not to say that they did not serve that role. I suspect they may well have done, but if they did, then Andrews, at least in what I have read, did not represent them in that way. So again, I think to recover that, if they did play that role, which wouldn't surprise me very much, almost always that's the case for natural history exploration, it would be very difficult to find information about that, I think. I should say one thing that's interesting is that this expedition was extreme, as I've tried to suggest, was extremely controversial in 1920s and early 1930s in China, and it, as far as I know, there was not another American paleontological expedition to the Gobi Desert until 1990, when another team of paleontologists from the same museum went back into the Gobi with the blessing of the Mongolian government. And in that case, the effort was made very, very consciously to work with local Mongolian people for the kinds of reasons that I think your question sort of has as a subtext, which is that if one really wants to create goodwill, then of course the right way to do it is to collaborate rather than to be seen to kind of expropriate specimens. And the way to collaborate would be to work with local people, and not just work with local people, but also acknowledge their contributions and make sure that the specimens stay in the local place rather than bringing them all back to Europe.
Professor Wang Wenqi.
I'm Wang Wenqi from university. I'm not an expert in American history of science. I'm wondering if there were similar done by Americans on other parts of the world. If that was the case, was the CAI part of a grand network of colonial capitals? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There were several other expeditions. The New York Natural History Museum is the one that I'm most familiar with. That's where I've done most of my own research. And there were expeditions, some very ambitious and well-publicized expeditions to Egypt, for example, in the 1890s. Other expeditions to Asia, kind of Pacific Islands. So my sense is that, of course, there's a long tradition of this kind of exploration in all sorts of different parts of the world. And for the United States, it's something that is quite new, sort of in the very late 19th century, I would say. So in the mid-19th century, there's, so early to mid-19th century, there's a, well, actually, no, I should take that back. So starting in the late 18th century, there's a strong push among American naturalists to explore the North American continent. It's in the second half of the 19th century, after the American Civil War, so in the 1860s and 70s, that the United States very quickly, because of the kind of very fast economic growth that I showed you in an early slide, the United States in the late 19th century became a global economic power. So that I think one sees this beginning of global exploration from American naturalists. So it's a kind of act of nationalism among the American paleontologists as well, I think. So to say that not only are the British and the Germans and the French and so on capable of exploring very remote parts of the globe, including the Arctic and the Antarctic, right? But the Americans are as well. And that's a way of kind of demonstrating for the United States to demonstrate to itself and to the rest of the world that it had arrived as a kind of global economic and scientific power. So there were other expeditions, and I think that and there certainly was a network, including there was private companies that produced logistical support for these expeditions and so on and so forth. So it was and you know, Asia Magazine, for example. So there's all sorts of companies that profit by distributing popular knowledge about these expeditions, and publishers and these lecture tours and so on and so forth. I think this is all part of this kind of network of not just producing the expeditions, but also publicizing them and trying to derive value, different kinds of value, not just economic, but also kind of scientific and other kinds of cultural value from and national value from the production of these very ambitious and well-publicized expeditions.
We have 3 questions, maybe.
I'm Marichu from the Institute of Modern History. My institute was established by funding from the Ford Foundation.
Yeah.
For the area study.
Yeah.
So my question is still on funding. The multiple research. And let me follow the point from Mr. Tan that there's a German precursor. He's a geologist. His name was called Rieppel.
Yeah.
And he made several expeditions in China in about 1860s or 70s. And his major sponsorship was from the Bank of California.
The Bank of which bank?
And when he came to China, then he got another sponsorship from the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce.
Oh, really?
So yes, so the Chamber of Commerce is a multinational. Its member was from various nations. So my question is about what's the difference between your expedition, your case, and between this case to the so-called precursor expedition?
Yeah.
The second head.
The Richthofen expedition.
Yes, please.
So that's another great question. So I think, yeah, I think you're right that these are, again, two questions that are quite similar. That's actually a great suggestion for kind of following up. So I know Shellen Wu has written Empires of Coal, which has a lot of information about the Richthofen expedition. So that's a place that I can look to kind of perhaps better understand some of the kind of historical context that you mentioned. So I would be very interested to learn. I'll just admit that I don't know as much about the von Richthofen expedition as I'd like to, and perhaps I ought to. I would like to know more about exactly who the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce was and what their role was in Shanghai. So were there Chinese companies involved in that, or was it all foreign? Yeah. So that to me suggests that there's actually something more similar here to my expedition in some ways than it's not completely distinct in every respect. In the sense that again it's an attempt among foreign powers, but again private, right? Not foreign governments, not states, but rather private enterprise to kind of produce knowledge that is useful and valuable for all sorts of reasons. And the value of that knowledge, at least in the case that you're describing, it sounds like, depends more perhaps on Chinese goodwill than in the case that I've been describing, which, as Professor Li pointed out, right, did create a huge amount of controversy and backlash among Chinese intellectuals. That said, so the question, so the expedition that I've been researching was entirely funded in the United States. So Andrews would spend the Gobi Desert during the summertime, and then often would spend a portion of the wintertime in Beijing, but would almost always go back to the United States in order to raise more funds. And those funds were raised in lots of different ways, including some of the ones that I've tried to show you, right? So fundraising very directly from private companies, kind of straightforward commercial ways, but also philanthropic. There was a huge amount of philanthropic funding, not just to this expedition, but for the New York Natural History Museum in general. So there's a kind of story that I haven't highlighted here, but then in my book I try to tell more extensively about an attempt among American capitalism to convert economic capital into social and cultural capital, in part through the funding of natural history museums and natural history expeditions. And for that conversion to be successful, it was important that these natural history activities be seen as a kind of dignified and scientific endeavor, not as an overtly commercial endeavor, which is part of the reason why all this kind of commercial stuff, talking about trying to control the flow of information and not making everything public, it was extremely important that the general public did not know that Standard Oil was paying for part of the expedition, that that Andrews was advertising these motor cars and so on and so forth. Because had that information been widely disseminated, then the expedition would have been of less philanthropic value. And that's also part of the reason why the sale of the dinosaur eggs was so controversial in the United States, is that again, it kind of undermined the philanthropic value of the expedition. So the kind of economics and the kind of imperialism that I'm trying to ascribe to the expedition was not straightforward. It was not purely commercial, and it was not purely exploitative. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it was something much richer and much more subtle and more complex than a purely exploitative, purely commercial, purely colonial sort of enterprise. But that it was nonetheless this, at least the suggestion I'd like to make is that because it was so much more subtle and complex, that's what allowed for the kind of neo-colonial success of the American open door policy and so on and so forth. That it wouldn't have been successful had it been done in the style of the British East India Company, for example.
Gentlemen there, and could you briefly introduce yourself or ask me a question?
I'm Bart, a student from NTU as well. First of all, thank you for a very interesting talk. What I found most interesting was the part where you talked about how they shot a lot of video material and would show this to the American audiences at home in movie theaters, and you introduce it as a sort of an advertisement for these cars. But if we tie this back into the whole imperialist project, then what I'm kind of interested in is how these video materials, when they are being introduced to the general public, how they kind of influence how American people imagine empire, and how this American empire is being imagined by average people. So not only focusing on, say, the commercial, the national interests of the expedition, but also the reception on the part of average Americans. That's what I would be interested in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fascinating question as well. I haven't done much research on this actually. So to look at how audiences responded, how audiences in the United States responded to, you could do it with the film material, but you could also do it, of course, with the other kind of popular material that was produced. So the magazine articles, the popular books, as opposed to the scientific books, and perhaps even the lectures. And I don't know, it would be difficult to locate that information archivally, but it would be worth someone, whether that person is me is the question is a very good one. So I think that you're exactly right that the conception. So one thing I should say is that Andrews himself strongly resisted the implication of the imperial project, and I think the U.S. Department of State would have resisted that implication. And for similar reasons, I think you're right that if I were to engage in a kind of a bigger kind of cultural history of American imperialism in the early first 2 decades of the 20th century or something like that, turn of the 20th century, I think you're right that that language would not have been used by people at the time. They would not have described the United States as a kind of empire. In fact, quite the opposite, right? That it was very important to America's national self-conception, and it continues to be very important. I make an argument that would not be accepted by American politicians today, right? So it continues to be very important to America's national self-conception that it not be considered an empire. The normal story of the United States is as a post-colonial country, right? That the United States had once been a colony of the British Empire and had thrown off its imperial yoke through a war of independence, and then created a foreign policy that was resistant to traditional 19th century style imperialism, right? So the Monroe Doctrine, which was an attempt to kind of prevent European powers from exercising their influence in the Americas. The open door policy, which was meant to be a kind of a commercial relationship to Asia rather than a traditional imperial relationship to Asia, and so on and so forth. So one thing I should mention is that there is a kind of brief, well, just very quickly, and Manifest Destiny would not have been, like westward expansion would not have been accepted as an act of colonialism, because of course it's an act of kind of internal, you might say, colonization, in the sense that it did not involve the creation of an overseas empire, right? It was the creation of a kind of continental empire, and which was understood, as the phrase manifest destiny suggests, it was understood as a kind of a God-given right that the United States had to expand westward across the continent that on which it was already located, and that the eradication of Native American populations was therefore seen as a kind of not as an act of imperialism, but rather as an act of civilization. Right? There was a very brief moment where the United States did flirt with and accept itself as a kind of traditional imperial power. So there was a war that was fought between the United States and Spain in 1898, the Spanish-American War, which the United States won, and as a result of which the United States created overseas colonies, traditional kinds of colonies in various places, including Puerto Rico and Cuba, but most famously the Philippines, and which led to a very long and very bloody armed conflict with in the Philippines with the resident populations in the Philippines. But the United States very, very quickly kind of turned its back to that sort of imperialism for lots of interesting reasons, many of which have to do with unwillingness among Americans to accept themselves as an imperial power in the frame or the mold of, let's say, the British Empire in the 19th century. And so I think if you ask, like, well, how would people in the early 20th century have understood these expeditions? I think, again, they would have seen them as a kind of scientific expedition, perhaps also as a commercial expedition, but that this would not have, that the connection between that and imperialism would have been rejected, would not have been accepted by people at the time.
Yes, Dr. Huang from Institute of Modern History.
Thank you, Shang-Hu Huang, postdoc fellow in Institute of Modern History. So my question is sort of follow the previous question. Originally I wanted to also ask the audience response, but since you already asked the question, so maybe I push it further. Because suppose there was a extensive coverage in American media, popular media about this expedition, probably it's very likely that in Chinese periodicals, newspapers, magazines, also will have the similar wide coverage. So because they might have reports, they write their own reports or translate source from the American media. So I wonder if that's kind of the circulation of the information, and also to see the different attitudes in, because I want to see the Chinese sides, how the popular media to cover, and also the audience, the readers' response. I mean, the Chinese readers' response to this engine.
Did you have a follow-up, like an immediate?
Sorry, maybe you answer first.
Okay. So thank you. Yeah. So there are some newspapers published in English in China that are available on the internet through databases and things that I've taken a look at. Something like about half a dozen that I've sort of looked at, and I was very surprised. I wanted exactly what you're suggesting. I wanted to see the reaction among Chinese intellectuals to the American expedition in these Chinese newspapers written in English. And I was really disappointed not to find that at all. That, in fact, most of what I found was the same kinds of arguments that I was seeing in American newspapers repeated in these English language Chinese newspapers. Very, very seldom, sometimes I found a kind of letter to the editor. I don't know enough about the kind of the history of the Chinese press to say this definitively, but the kind of impression I got just from reading the newspapers that I had access to was that these were newspapers that were produced by and for the kind of expatriate community in China, English language newspapers that cater to English speakers living in China, and therefore kind of reproduced the views of that community, which were not, I think, mostly not the views of the Chinese intellectuals themselves. The very few exceptions I found is where some of these English language newspapers produce an editorial or an article or something defending the American expedition against the Antiquities Commission, the claims of the Antiquities Commission, and then sometimes there would be a response, like a letter to the editor from someone who was more, a Chinese intellectual who was more sympathetic to the Antiquities Commission. But that was very rare. I found almost none. But again, if people have suggestions for anything I can read in English that might give me more access to what the response among Chinese intellectuals was, I would be incredibly grateful for that. So I haven't found that yet, but if you know of anything, then please email me and tell me.
One suggestion to look to the Chinese language.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, it's a big thing that Dr. Yan Xiaopei.
Yeah.
I think her works, projects,
yes.
documented you very well.
Yeah.
She's working on the Chinese side.
Right.
Yeah, and Dr. Lei Xiang Institute about the issue.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Interesting tension within your talk. Because on the one hand, you characterize this exhibition as kind of a new colonialism. But the reason you characterize it as a colonialism was not a reason that Chinese intellectuals, imperialism.
Yeah.
So therefore I wonder to what degree this was because this took place in China. So because of the limit of my knowledge, I want to ask you a naive question. Why this took place not? Were Canadian scientists very happy that the Americans took away the eggs of dinosaurs? And so this is just a normal practice of science. And also to follow your question, would Andrew did the same thing, did a similar kind of intelligence gathering if this exhibition take place in Canada?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it would not have taken place in Canada, certainly not. Yeah, of course not. So there were, so in the late 19th century, dinosaur discoveries were in the West in the kind of Rocky Mountain regions. And of course, the Rocky Mountains extend north into Canada. So there were expeditions into Canada that did bring specimens to the United States, and that did not cause an international sensation. I should mention, though, that there's a very interesting close parallel with archaeological specimens, where European, in fact, Scandinavian, so there's a kind of interesting parallel to the Sven Hedin expedition, in that there were Scandinavian archaeologists who exported American archaeological artifacts from the American West. Let them publish monographs and scientific publications about these specimens in Europe, which led to the creation of the American Antiquities Act in 1909, the purpose of which was to prevent the collection and exploitation of archaeological artifacts. So there's a very clear parallel there, and so I think you're exactly right to kind of point out that. So, for example, had Chinese intellectuals, they would not have done this, of course, but had it been kind of historically possible for the Antiquities Committee to come to the United States and take American certain archaeological artifacts back to China, I think that there would have been outrage in the United States. So I think there's a clear asymmetry. There's a kind of double standard that's at work here. Yeah.
First, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your lecture. And my question is, why Andrew can make such a great profit? Is that time in American the popular culture is male dominated, so the expenditure is very popular, and all people are really interested in that. And also interesting why at that time scientific research can be a kind of entertainment for many people. They they are interested in scientific research. So when the people's worldview have changed, when their interests have changed, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think your two questions actually go together quite well. So much of what, my sense is that much of what made not only this expedition, but so much of natural history exploring, not only in the early 20th century, but throughout its history, you know, Humboldt in the 18th century, Livingston in the 19th century, right? That it's a kind of adventure. And it was producing these lectures and books and magazine articles and so on was a very kind of genre that Andrews was engaging in. And it was, I think you're exactly right to say that it was a very masculine kind of genre. So again, I think it's important not to assume that there is a distinction between, let's say, the production of scientific knowledge and the production of adventure stories. I think that they were exactly the consonant with one another. That science and adventure were understood as being complementary or very similar to one another, and that's part of the reason I think that science was considered so popular among a kind of general reading public. Is that it wasn't only about difficult to understand recondite knowledge. It was also about danger and masculinity and exploration and so on and so forth. Which actually, one thing I want to say very quickly, so someone asked about local people. That's something, local people in Mongolia, the leader of Mongolian people like that. One place they often show up in Andrews' publications is as bandits. So Andrews often liked to describe himself as this kind of heroic male you know, strongman type of figure. And in order to present himself in that way, it was important for him to enter into lots of conflicts with people. And so often these conflicts were with, you know, local highway robbers or people like that who would try to rob the expedition, and then Andrews had to kind of save the day by, you know, sort of demonstrating the superior fighting force of the American explorers and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you also for a really interesting talk today. My question kind of follows up on two of the previous questions as well, about that they were more about the reactions in popular culture, but I'm looking more at the reactions maybe in the scientific community, because if you're seeing scientific knowledge, of course, also as a form of resource, one form to measure that resource would, of course, be as it is today, as it looks back then, publications. So I'm kind of wondering, have you looked at the publications about the expedition, maybe not just in the 1 or 2 years after it, but maybe also, I don't know, the decades afterwards, and seen, were they mostly, did they mostly stem from the US? Was there publications in other parts of the world, maybe even in China later? Which also, I guess, then is related to the question of access to the specimens, because I work with zoological specimens, so those are a bit more mobile, I would guess, than paleontological ones. Yeah. So, yeah, I wonder if that also feeds into your conclusion as well.
Yeah, interesting. I haven't done like an exhaustive search of all of everything that's ever been published on this material and the scientific literature, but again, my sense is that it is overwhelmingly in the United States. Again, if there was scientific publications that, for example, came out of Academia Sinica, I would love to know about those. There's again a kind of language issue for me where I don't read Chinese. I suspect I would be very surprised if there was, simply because the specimens were all taken out of, were all shipped back to New York. There was a promise that was made by Andrews and the American Museum in New York to send specimens after. So what the claim that they always made was that, well, the specimens have to be shipped back to New York because they have to be prepared. So as you say, paleontological specimens are very difficult to work with, and you know, they come encased in rock. And so it's a very difficult and time-consuming, laborious process to remove all of the surrounding mock matrix to lay bare the specimen. And the claim was that this had to be done by expert practitioners in the paleontological laboratories at the New York Museum. But once this had been done, that the New York Museum was open to a negotiation about sending, for example, any duplicate specimens back to China. That didn't happen. So that's a promise that was made that was never fulfilled. Perhaps in part because the expedition proved so controversial that they were entirely expelled from China. So perhaps if the relationship had maintained, maybe there would have been more reciprocity. But certainly as things played out, that promise was never kept. And that's, I presume, why the publication record is what it is.
I think we only have time for 2 short questions. So first, and then Salva.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk.
My name is Jun-Yi Tsai, and I'm a colleague of Guangji's at NTU. And I'm interested, because I teach the history of Taiwan's museums at NTU. So I'm interested from a museological perspective. Because a lot of the museums nowadays are engaged in a self-critique of their colonial and imperial roots. And by characterizing the CAE as this kind of intelligence gathering mission or a kind of neo-colonialist campaign, I wonder what the New York Natural History Museums, how are they dealing with this part of their history that led to their procurement of the Gobi fossils, and how are they responding to your characterization?
Thank you. They're unaware of my characterization at the moment, so I don't suspect that they will be. So if this version of things, if this version ends up looking similar to what the published version looks like, I suspect that they won't be very happy with it. So I'm actually curious if you want to respond quickly, but my sense is that the kind of self-critique that you were mentioning has been much more thorough in anthropology and archaeology museums than in natural history museums. So certainly in the US, I think that's the case. And so so for example, archaeology and natural history and ethnography museums are much more willing to repatriate specimens than natural history museums. As far as I know, there's been no serious discussion about repatriating any of these specimens to China. I know for sure that there's been attempts among certain Native American communities in the American West to have dinosaur fossils, which play an important role in Native American cosmology as well as in Western evolutionary theory, to have some of those dinosaur fossils repatriated to Native American groups. And that's been completely unsuccessful. There's been no willingness on the part of American natural history museums, at least, to do that. So yeah, I think my sense is that they would not be very receptive to this style of critique. But I should say in their defense, though, that the work in Mongolia has been taken up again more recently, and it's been done, I think, very deliberately in a much more diplomatic and careful kind of way. So it's not as though they haven't learned any lessons in the last 100 years.
Because of the time limit, I have to cut short of my question. And my question would be a little bit related to Wenji's question about network. So, like, how much was the role of China in the establishment of the United States as a new form of empire? The reason why I asked this question was because China, the United States was a latecomer in terms of all forms of empires to China. But because I'm an anthropologist, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm an anthropologist working on post-1949 China, and from the next building, Institute of Ethnology. And after 1949, China considered the United States as the #1 target to be against empire, imperialism, not the Britain, but it's the United States. So I'm not expert in the part of history. But I'm just curious about, because I consider your very inspiring case as kind of like as a very important case to understand the formation of the United States as the cultural empire. So I'm just requesting additional information about like how much was the role of China in terms of this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the United States, of course, had a very long commercial relationship with China. So the United States engaged in the China trade, porcelain and other commodities in the 17th century already. And so there was the kind of commercial relationship between American merchants and the Chinese is quite old. So in a sense, if the argument I'm making is that this kind of neo-colonial enterprise that emerges around the turn of the 20th century is a kind of a way of characterizing an emerging world of global capitalism. In a sense, there's a kind of long prehistory to that, and China certainly plays an important role in that prehistory. So the American open door policy to China, for example, is the kind of classic case. That said, I think that certainly among American historians, the vast majority of there is a literature on neo-colonialism and global capitalism in 20th century America. And as far as I know, I think very little, if any, of it is about China. The vast majority is literature dealing with Latin America. So the United States had a very kind of, a much more overt kind of commercial imperialist relationship to Latin America, where, for example, United Fruit, a kind of corporation engaged in the production and export of Latin American fruit, it more or less kind of influenced the politics of various Latin American countries in Europe during much of the 20th century. So most of the literature about kind of this sort of private neo-colonial capitalist sort of American empire has been focused on Latin America, not China. But I think, so I think the case is different in China. I think it's a bit more, it's a less kind of strong imperialism perhaps. But the suggestion I'm trying to make is that we can tell a similar sort of story about the American open door policy, and that there's an interesting connection to the science of natural history. Yeah.
Right. I know there are a lot of questions that are still going to be raised, but the time is up. We already spent 2 hours, and I think we need to give our lecturer a break. And so let's thank Lukas again for very stimulating lectures and also very fruitful discussion.
And thank all of you so much. Okay.
Yeah, the restaurant.
Yeah. So you were like a